Presenting today. And I just wanted to remind everyone that CIRM is undergoing a strategic allocation framework or prioritization of how we will be allocating money over the course of the next several years and what we're looking for. Part of this group's task is to understand how we can be helpful to provide suggestions on how to get some of these products through, and also how to provide a framework for access and affordability at the same time. So Jeff, if you want to start, thank you very much.
Yes, let me start with the roll. Maria Bonneville.
Present.
Kim Barrett.
Present.
Dan Bernal. Dan Bernal. No. David Higgins. Vito Ambasciani.
Present.
Pat Levitt.
Present.
Adriana Padilla.
Here.
Ann Boyington.
Here.
James De Benedetti.
Here.
Dana Dorsite. Ted Goldstein. Darius Lakdwala. Harlan Levine.
Present.
Amar Kadan.
Present.
Mashawari Sentil. Adrian Shapiro.
Present.
And Christina Hartman.
Present.
Thank you. And Jeff, if you'd like to start with the presentation, that'd be wonderful.
Yep. All right, so it's not moving. Can I get the next slide, please?
Sure.
Thank you. We've broken the agenda into two parts. First, we'd like to provide some short updates on program activities, followed by an in-depth discussion of our strategic allocation framework, where we intend to dedicate the majority of the meeting time. So let me just begin with some updates. Next slide, please. First of all, on the patient support program, we'd like to acknowledge our newest team member, Blanca Battle. Blanca brings over 20 years of experience in the biotech industry with expertise spanning program management, launch readiness, training, and access reimbursement. Her areas of focus lie in access and reimbursement domain, where she has excelled in leading patient assistance programs, facilitating patient onboarding, and providing field support. Blanca is leading up the effort to design the patient support program around the needs of our clinical partners, and we really appreciate her effort. As part of that process, we've had a kickoff meeting. We had that before the May meeting, but we skipped this update, so we were going to update you then in May on the kickoff, and then we've been meeting weekly with the awardee Eversana, with the aim of piloting the support program in the final quarter of this year and the first quarter of 25. Next slide, please. The Community Care Centers of Excellence program, I'd like to acknowledge Emily Crotty for her efforts. She's really led the organizing and management of the application of the RFA and application process. We've sponsored 2 webinars. The first webinar provided an overview of the program aims and objectives, and the second focused on the mechanics of the application and budgeting process. The Community Care Centers of Excellence program is attracting a number of applicants that are new to the CIRM process. So these webinars have provided an important opportunity to address their questions. And with that, I'd like to also acknowledge the grants management and review teams, as their expertise has been essential for guiding applicants and recruiting qualified reviewers. Next slide, please. In June, the NIH issued a request for information on a proposed policy requiring access plans for clinical research programs within its intramural research program, its main funding portfolio. The deadline to comment on this request for information was in July, which was between AAWG meetings. So we convened a small group of advisors to provide feedback and comments on the policy. This feedback has been posted on the website as part of the meeting notice. To summarize, I think the spirit of our comments, we suggested the overall approach could be meritorious. In fact, it's consistent with some of the recommendations we're going to consider today, but noted that the NIH emphasized many strategies that make it incumbent on the investigator or sponsor to offer flexible IP or licensing agreement terms. So we emphasize in the context of cell and gene therapies, one must be aware of the substantial demand side or market barriers that limit availability and sustainability of cell and gene therapy products. And we offered some examples of actions NIH could take to address these barriers. We felt it was important to comment because the NIH effort represents a proposal for a foundational national policy framework to promote access of products stemming from clinical research. And again, this policy framework appears consistent with our strategic allocation framework discussion. So that's all I have in the way of updates. I'll pause for a moment to see if there's any questions or comments. And if not, I can turn it over to Rosa, who will initiate the second part of the meeting, the agenda today.
Does anyone have any comments?
I was going to ask this, Pat. I was going to ask the CTSI program has, a major focus on community engagement, including the components of AAWG, and I'm wondering whether those individuals, those program folks who oversee that, have there been any conversations with them about what they're looking for? There's renewals going on all the time. I was just at a meeting yesterday for the one here, and I think we spent more than half the time talking about community engagement and access, et cetera. So I'm just wondering if the NIH engagement included the CTSI programs, which are a number of them in California.
So in the request for information, they certainly, as a category as a strategy, they called out community engagement as a major activity. I don't recall if they called out the CTSI programs specifically, but obviously I think in our case, particularly because the Alpha clinics have really integrated with their CTSI programs, that would be a major, that relationship would be important towards this effort. So, but certainly the activities themselves were, I think, one among 5 major activities that NIH recommended as part of the access planning.
Yeah, so it may be, I mentioned a CIRM yesterday when I was at that meeting here that included that was the USC CHLA CTSI, and Tom Buchanan was quite enthusiastic about thinking about how to engage with you all to see how things can be aligned, which would leverage, they have resources, you have resources.
Yeah.
Leveraging those without, I'm not talking about exchanging finance or anything, but planning so that they're aligned, which means that more would get done in terms of community engagement would be something to have a conversation about. If you want an intro to, I think some of you on the Zoom know Tom, so
yeah,
I think that UCLA has one, UCSF.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
I think it's worth investigating.
I think part of what Jeff was alluding to was that the Alpha clinics have used them and integrated them into their community engagement plans, but it's absolutely worth it to reach out to them individually as well. So Jeff, that's just something we should add to our planning calendar, which is packed. So yes, absolutely.
Agreed, and that is definitely like I say, there's already momentum in that direction, but to the extent we can sort of double down on that effort, we can do that.
Kim.
Yeah, to add to Pat's helpful comment, I think a similar comment could be made about the comprehensive cancer centers that exist across the landscape in California. They also have major efforts, and I know our cancer center and our CTSC collaborate as well on community outreach. So there's an opportunity there as well.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned this because, but I'm getting the feeling that people are sort of in, and the efforts are earnest and really, a lot of
Yes,
real high quality. But I think they tend to be, all this is being done in like separate lanes.
I agree.
Sharing information about what's working and what's not will save a lot of time and effort, and then incorporating things that people have found work well, particularly in communities where it's been extremely challenging to make inroads in terms of even talking about, clinical trials and participation and access. I think would be worth it. Maybe the lanes can cross at some point.
I agree. I think there's a lot. I think we can say that about a lot of the things that we're trying to do. There are so many efforts being done collectively in the field, at institutions we fund, and consolidating our efforts would really go a long way. So thank you, Pat and Kim. Appreciate that.
Maybe just to add one more comment on that as it relates to the community care centers of excellence. So Pat, I think your message has been received in terms of we need to really increase referral rates. And so as we've been meeting with applicants, we've really been socializing this idea that the cancer centers will be an important element to those patient referrals, achieving that goal of improving referral rates. So again, we've got the message. It's definitely part of the message in terms when we strategize with potential applicants about ways in which they can be responsive to the RFA. And I also want to acknowledge the Alpha clinics that they've, over time, really those relationships with the cancer centers have matured to the point where I think they're far more collaborative than they were when the program first started. So I think that there is crossover occurring. To the extent we've optimized that crossover, I don't know, but it's definitely part of the overall strategy we've been taking in terms of trying to be responsive to that referral gap you've alluded to.
Yeah, that's great. And to give full credit for Chris Young, who is a Compass Scholar, by the way. He's an undergraduate who was the initiator of the conversations that he and I had, and then brought in Jeff. The Compass Scholar program deserves a ton of credit for having people students as talented as Chris to even think about this. So he deserves a ton of credit.
Thank you, Pat. Kim.
Not to add yet another potential partner into the mix, but we've been having lots of conversations with the VA around access for clinical trials. And obviously they serve an incredibly diverse population across the state and really in all sorts of nooks and crannies, particularly our Northern California VA, which has an incredibly large catchment area. But they are very interested in partnering, at least with us, and probably as a partner with these sorts of efforts. Maybe Vito would want to comment on that as well.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, I know the medical director at the Sacramento-based center at Mather, and I know that he is very, very eager to expand the fourth mission. It's not just training and to be available in time of a national catastrophe, but to train the next generation of healthcare workers. And this would be, and access would be part of his mission. So David Stockwell, he's incredibly engaged. I'm sure you know him personally. If I can personally intervene or be an adjunct to your efforts, consider me available to you.
Thank you.
Any other comments before we move on? Okay, I think Rosa's up next. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Madam Chair Bonneville. So let me just check that this is working.
Excuse me, this is Beth. I'm having a hard time hearing Rosa.
Okay.
Want to switch me?
Let me just move the computer. Yeah, I'll move over there. And you need to.
Yeah.
Thank you. We are just rejigging the situation here. Just give us a second. So as Chair Bonneville was mentioning, we have been undergoing a strategic allocation framework. Next slide. I think you need to go there, really. Just next. I'll just keep telling you next. Okay.
Go ahead.
As we already mentioned during our last accessibility and affordability working group meeting back in May, we presented how we are developing the goals and the recommendations. And just to ensure ample time for discussion, the background that we've provided several times to the board and also to this working group will not be presented during today's meeting. And for those interested, these sections were previously presented at length during the June 27th ICOC meeting. So feel free to review those slides accordingly. We are going to move on to the timeline. Just as a refresher, next slide, Emily, thank you. Can you hear me, Beth?
That's better.
Okay. So as we saw back in, as we presented back in May, the goal for the discussions of this group in the context of the accessibility and affordability goal were to brainstorm around the different types of questions that would be necessary to answer the main question, which is to ensure that every CIRM-funded project completing a later stage clinical trial has a strategy that enables access and affordability by all California patients. And that question was presented back in May. And the work that this working group with Jeff and Maria's leadership has been undergoing is to evaluate the type of questions and data that we would need to make recommendations at the September 13th Science Subcommittee and Neuro Task Force meeting, where we will be presenting all the recommendations for each one of the impact goals. So today we are going to go over some of the considerations that this group has convened in terms, and these considerations will be the ones that will help us derive recommendations and present them at the September meeting. So just to, next slide. So next slide. As I was mentioning, we have 4 categories in which we've been developing this strategic allocation framework, and there's a full category for accessibility and affordability of CIRM-funded cell and gene therapies, which is obviously very relevant because that's kind of where we are going to make therapies for patients and that they are accessible and affordable as per Proposition 14. So this group developed with CIRM staff, developed a goal, an impact goal, which was to ensure that every CIRM-funded project completing a later stage clinical trial has a strategy that enables access and affordability by all California patients, particularly underserved populations. And what we were talking about earlier in terms of increasing referral rates, and aligning with federal and also California government policy strategies, all these fits within the granularity of what we need to do in this exercise, which is to provide recommendations at a high level, either programmatic or policy or process recommendations that will then be implemented. But in order to do that, we need to gather data. And that's what Jeff has been doing with Chair Bonneville's leadership. So the next slide provides an overview of the high-level questions. Next slide. Oh, sorry, go back. So the goal today will be to go over the high-level questions that were developed, the considerations that Jeff will be running us through, and then a discussion framed within some high-level questions that Chair Bonneville has shared with this working group. Next slide. The questions at a high level is how will CIRM align with CMS cell and gene therapy access model? what are the most impactful factors for achieving access and affordability? What is the research that we need to understand the landscape for access and affordability? And how are we going to gather all that landscape and succinctly put it in a way that we can evaluate what fits best our needs, right? And all of this needs to be in the context of what we are talking in terms of the cell and gene therapies that we are moving to the clinical as well, right? So those are questions that this group needs to evaluate. What general policies within CIRM could be developed to facilitate access and affordability? This links to number 3. What are the barriers to access and affordability for cell gene therapies? And at what stage should the applicants provide an access and affordability strategy, for example? So these could be, in terms of what would derive from here, would be programmatic, the amendments to programs or changes to already funded programs that we need to tell them now, you need to provide these as well, right? So those are the recommendations that this group can provide to the ICOC. How can strategies be scaled if the therapy is successful, and what are additional opportunities for access and affordability? So taking these very high level questions, we went into some considerations. Next slide. And we will not go through these considerations because these are part of the Goal 5 document that the team posted in preparation for this meeting, and I'm sure that everybody has had a chance to go over them. And then without less preamble, I will just pass the baton to my colleague Jeff Lomax, who's going to run us through the next slides that present the high-level factors and the questions. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Rosa. Thanks for that introduction. So before jumping into what would otherwise just be a list of policy options, I wanted to provide a little bit of context for how these options relate to decision-making that impact access. At least as I've come to understand the space, there are 3 driving factors that impact access. So first, price being the most obvious. If we're not dealing with multi-million-dollar treatments, we'd probably not need this working group. And it's worth noting that there are a number of cell and gene therapy programs in the CIRM portfolio that are really aiming for substantial cost reductions. So price as a kind of overall strategy is something that it has a strong potential within our portfolio. The second factor, again, when we're looking at access and reimbursement policy, is health gain. How much health do we get for that price, and how does that compare to the standard of care? As noted in the background materials, one rationale for CMS's selection of sickle cell disease in their gene therapy pilot was that the current cost of the healthcare system for managing this disease is estimated at around $3 billion per year, with about 50 to 60% of that cost falling on public payers. So the potential for avoided costs associated with treatments can be compelling. And then the line below, the interaction between price and health gain is fundamental in the context of discussions over value-based pricing. So again, as noted in the background materials, there are a number of considerations that go into these value assessments, including factors like magnitude of effect, durability of the treatment, and delivery factors such as in and out patient treatment. So again, these are options sort of laid out in the background document. I'd also be remiss if I didn't note some written comments provided by Dr. Levine, noting that value assessment should not be the sole determinant of whether a therapy is accessible to patients. So I wanted to note that as well. In the context of Goal 5, a fundamental question you may want to consider is to what extent we would like to see or recommend value assessments be incorporated into access strategies or plans. And then just returning to a moment to our comments on the proposed NIH policy, our comments suggested that NIH may be overemphasizing factors related to price, putting the onus on developers to cut costs. But when it comes to cell and gene therapies, they may want to consider value in the broader context of market barriers and health gains. And finally, even if one can demonstrate value, there's no access guarantee. Payers remain concerned about actuarial uncertainty or the overall demand for these products. And to emphasize this, CMS just published this week its reimbursement rules for the 2025 fiscal year. And despite the evidence of long-term value in sickle cell treatments, they decided against increasing the reimbursement rate for approved sickle cell treatments. So they refused to increase these rates so they're more in line with providers' cost. And CMS specifically stated, we recognize that payments would not fully cover a hospital's cost. We remain concerned about the extremely high cost of these products and want to ensure we do not create incentives to increase prices. So CMS policy is indicative of a healthcare financing system that is sensitive to the financial impact of these treatments, particularly if there's a surge in demand. In short, these treatments are not well aligned for a financing system that operates on annual appropriations and open enrollment periods. So with that, can I get the next slide, please? So with that background in mind, we asked you to consider two questions. Are there specific options CIRM should prioritize or triage? And again, that's among the list of options that we've developed. And in addition, are there opportunities that are really missing from the table that should be considered in the context of the strategic allocation framework? And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Chair Bonneville and see if you have any additional comments.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That's really well laid out, so I appreciate that. Hand raised, Amar.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. I mean, this is what I live day and night, basically around demonstrating value. And I know we discussed this before. Who's responsible for that within the current clinical trial program? Because in industry, for example, we have a team of health economists who would be working on defining those kinds of endpoints and making sure that those studies are aligned with those endpoints so that we have a good read about that value once the study is done. Who's responsible here? That's my question. And the second, I suggested before that probably we need a health economist on full-time maybe basis. I know some of the experts in this group are health economists as well by training. Some of them are attending on regular basis, some are not. So there needs to be more accountability on how we drive this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
So I think in terms of who's responsible, I think the proverbial, it depends. It depends on the sponsor. We have a very diverse set of sponsors in our portfolio. I think some have do apply the approach that was alluded to. Others, they may not that level of planning may not be baked in. I think that's why the overarching recommendation is that every late stage program should have some kind of a strategy. So I think that you've really spoken to the underpinnings of this recommendation is that at some level, there's going to be some baseline level of expectation that this analysis is occurring. Currently, that is not required.
Thank you, Jeff. Harlan.
Thank you. Very good report. I have a few comments. One is I just want to clarify my comments to Jeff, and I think the sickle cell is an example. I am a supporter that value should trump many decisions, but I think my point was there are some treatments that will have such significant clinical benefit that you can't really balance price and benefit. That we as a society haven't decided that we're going to withhold great treatments. It's the health plans that are making these decisions, and I think we need to pull it back to a more of a societal comment. Anyway, putting that aside, you talked about on slide, I think 23, the other feature I would add is capability. So there's price, there's gain, there's demand, but there's also capability to deliver these programs. The thing, the decision on sickle cell, I think, is indicative of two things. One is the willingness to put the burden on the hospital system instead of pharma, and also to leave that tension there as a way to really limit access. And I think we need to, bring some transparency and shine some light on that. That's really no way to address this issue, because what it does is perpetuates inequality, because people with better health plans will have access to these things and people without. The main last point and main point I want to make on what was missing on those list of questions, I think we should ask ourselves, what partnerships are needed to drive the results that we want? And so, for example, if you want access to underrepresented communities, how do you tap into the Medicaid HMOs? On their own, left to their own devices, they will never get at this. But if you partner them with a cancer center or some other multi-hospital system that's able to deliver on late phase trials and deliver early released medications, you can begin to bake it into, or force baking it into their system. The problem today is a lot of the doctors in those networks will never refer patients because it's not part of their day-to-day operations. So we have to figure out how to bake that in. Providence may or may not be able to do phase 1 trials, but they have a large network. So let's partner them with someone who is able to do phase 1 trials. So I think partnerships are going to be key to get at some of those markets. UCLA and City of Hope are already in underrepresented markets. I don't know about some of the other multi-hospital academic centers, but I'm sure that they are. We should take advantage of their networks to leverage their capability and drive it into the into underrepresented communities.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? So if you go to our sort of list of options, we've called out the California Cancer Care Act as a potential starting point for driving some of those. So that's one opportunity. I know it's not quite in line with the access planning, but we thought it was important to include as part of the broader strategy and policy initiatives. Do you see that piece of legislation as a sort of a primary opportunity we should be developing to sort of achieve the outcome you just described?
I do. I think it's a template for two reasons. So for those that don't know, it's the California Cancer Care Equity Act. It basically says two things. That one is that patients have a right to get to the level of care that's needed for their complex cancer. But the second piece is there's an affirmative obligation to actually inform the patient. And now, whether that's happening or not, I don't know, but we're having discussions with the state right now. In fact, they're having discussions with us that are very positive about having people hired to help with the implementation and the oversight of the program. So, and the other piece of legislation that is applicable here is there's going to be an evaluation process every year to see what constitutes a new complex need that's being unmet. I think that's exactly the template we can use here to say that we think that it's a right of patients to have access to these drugs. We don't know what they are today, but we'll sit down and evaluate every 6 months, every 12 months, and then make sure that the HMOs have an affirmative obligation to make patients aware, make the doctors aware of these opportunities. And then we have to measure it. That's the piece that's missing so far. But I think the state has really showed good intent to try to solve the problem of implementation and oversight.
Absolutely, Harlan. Just so you know, our team sat with some of the folks responsible for implementation. I'm sure it got back to you because City of Hope representatives were there as well. That was incredibly helpful and provide an opportunity. So much of what Pat talks about is there's a lot of people doing things that help move this forward. And the more we can all be aligned and the more we can all come together, it really helps. So thank you also for your help with that, Harlan. Appreciate it. Adrian, you had your hand raised, but it's not raised anymore. So I wanted to ask if you wanted.
Well, I did. I just want to
Okay,
second
great.
what Harlan was saying. And
Okay.
it's really, really important that when we're looking at this and we're talking about care, we have to look beyond the care that we offer with these new treatments, but as to what's the baseline care that people with a given disease are facing on a daily basis. And so I just wanted to say thank you to him. Because sometimes I know I'm preaching to the choir, but the more of our voices that speak to that, the better. So I won't go over what he said again. I won't be redundant, but thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. I appreciate that. Does anyone else have any questions? I have a question for the group if nobody else has a question. In putting together sort of our future RFAs, program announcements, things like that, how much weight do you think should be given to access strategies as part of the overall application, and how reasonable do we think it is that they would be in a position where they could put something like this together to provide as part of an application for funding? Amar, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is the same question is being asked today by many startup companies when they approach VCs around funding. The traditional approach has been focused just on regulatory approval, get the product to market, and that's it. And now there are many of them who realize that they need to think about those things in advance and build abilities, as probably Harlan mentioned.
Yep.
So there needs to be at least I would say a very lean, and I'll go back and be more direct. I think we need to have at least one person in our organization who is able to oversee those. Sometimes we need to do it ourselves. In the majority of the cases, through partners. So the short answer is we need to have that as part of any funding in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you think it should start earlier in the development cycle, or is it appropriate as they're preparing the clinical stage? Is it something that can be done sooner in the development process?
I think earlier is better. Now we can decide on how much earlier. Definitely earlier is better. As products move from phase 1 to phase 2, you need to have a strategy, probably.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I think my thoughts mirror Amar's. I would just say I like the way it was worded as late stage for now.
Okay.
I interviewed a lot of our scientists here, and I can't say I agreed with them, but they made a compelling argument that it's very difficult early stages when you don't know what direction things are going to go to also be thinking about cost. And what we decided was we need to leverage AI, not so much GAI, but AI and the new techniques to lower the cost, and maybe think about reducing the cost of manufacturing when we're choosing, path A versus path B. But beyond that, it's really putting a heavy burden on basic scientists who don't even actually, they don't even care about the profitability. I mean, they're in it for the science, and it would be a sea change for them to worry about it. So I think focusing on later stage and then letting it permeate earlier over time is the right approach. And I don't want to put words in Amar's mouth, but that's kind of what I heard, and I think it's the right. He said it more eloquently, but I think I wanted to reinforce it. We should start with what we know we can do, which is the later stages, and then not put a unreasonable expectation on the academic centers until we're ready.
Great, thank you for that feedback, and thanks for checking in with scientists and getting their opinion. I appreciate that. Anne.
Is sort of on Harlan's point, is there a way that we can, I agree, focusing on later stage, but they could get a very long ways down and not have thought about it at all. So is there
Sure.
a way early on to begin the process of making sure folks are thinking that way as they move through development?
Jeff?
So I think that the sense is yes. I mean, there'd be certain, early on, I think going back to that 3-point chart, I mean, you certainly want to be able to, I think there's issues both of cost. You could ask us, there could be a series of probes, for example, like, what have you considered, opportunities for cost reduction? I mean, we have a manufacturing network, we have a set of infrastructure, in the CIRM ecosystem, and probes around, to what extent, those resources, can be brought to bear, early on. At least, asking those questions is useful, because often applicants may not even have visibility to those resources. And, having processes where we can have the applicants, interact is, valuable. Because as I indicated, we are starting to see applications come in that are really looking at ways of reducing cost, and that's important. I think, the other piece, I think the part that's a little bit harder is when you start getting into the questions around, kind of reimbursement and insurance. But again, so those might become later stage, because you're not going to know at that point, until you go through that development. It could be years off, and then you've got, what does the rest of the market look like? What's the price of the standard of care? So I think it's sort of looking at in a staged way, and that's, I think, if you look at what was in the NIH RFI, they allude to a similar approach, a kind of staged approach where there are smart questions you can ask early, but recognizing some of the other questions you won't know until you get into that later stage of development.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, I think what we need to disentangle and make that, maybe for another meeting is, what are those questions and, where to start, but so.
Does anyone else have any comments or questions of the group? Jeff, do you feel like you've gotten a good start or idea of how the group feels about the questions moving forward and what to include in the strategic allocation framework for consideration?
I guess yes and no. I think what we've heard, as if I'm hearing the sense of the working group, is that the overall idea of access strategy is that needs to happen. That needs to happen, and it needs to be sort of appropriate to the stage of development. We have, made some suggestions in terms of sort of specifics. Maybe they're too granular, but I mean, it would again be helpful if, and it doesn't necessarily have to happen in this meeting, but through follow-up correspondence, if you could sort of look at some of the specific recommendations, or I wouldn't say recommendations, specific options, and give us some sense if there are things you think that are more and less important at this time, because it's a long list. As we've alluded to here, some of them, require substantial engagement within the state of California, for example, yes. Medi-Cal. Others would require engagement with, perhaps NIH or so, and that does bring up sort of, bandwidth issues and prioritization. How to, where should we start? And I know that could change overnight depending on
sure.
a new piece of legislation, but to the extent there's feedback on any of the specifics, that's helpful for guiding our sort of day-to-day operations.
Thank you. And just as an update for the group, we have started conversations with various groups within state government, including Medi-Cal, about how to partner with them, how to partner and bring information in. There are no solutions to this yet, and that's an ongoing process. But we do have touch points in, and that's really valuable for everyone. And I think will go a long way. We are also sponsoring a couple of different conferences in the upcoming months where some of these questions will be asked, and we plan on bringing all of that feedback to this group to get their input as well. And I just got a note that said Ted Goldstein has a comment, so I'm going to say, Ted, please unmute yourself and ask away.
Thanks so much. So just one quick point in that we may want to make as part of the public strategy that any of the that increases their points of and likelihood for funding if the clinical trials come to us with a strategy for mass production, and that pointing so that we turn it around, because we know that this sort of bespoke creation of stem cells is not scalable, but there is creativity going on in the community to make a more of a common manufacturing technology. And it would be very good if we just said, hey, this would come to us with your ideas and solutions, and that would increase the likelihood of funding.
Thank you. Jeff?
Agreed, and I think that relates, again, back to Anne's comment, what are I think on that manufacturing side, that's probably something that could be looked at earlier in terms of strategy, and just to acknowledge too, that's a very dynamic space at the moment. We're seeing the emergence of a lot of automated systems. There's again a lot of interest within our own infrastructure network to deploy some of these novel systems that could really impact cost. That's the plan. So those are things I think that again can come up early on, and a reminder that any clinical stage program, if they don't have a compelling and feasible manufacturing strategy, they're not going to get funded. So we've already have the sort of framework where those sorts of issues come up, and to the extent, again, there might be additional questions we should be asking at certain stages, we'd be, we could, bring those questions forward.
Thank you. Ted, did you want to?
Yeah, no, just it strikes me that what we're looking at, of course, is fundamental changes to the immune architecture of stem cells, and that itself, of course, is probably its own CIRM class program. But if we could show the way to it, and there are some of the some proposals which I think have that I've seen look more optimistic about teaching how to cope with the MHC compatibility issues and other specific things that are not necessarily important to the specific first product, right? But clearly would show how to create follow-on products. So anyway, optimistic, and I think it's part of as well what we're going to learn from. But we need at least one large-scale program that doesn't break the bank. So
agree.
Anyway,
thank you.
We're on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone on the working group have any other comments? Are there any public comments? Claudette or Amelie, do you see anything?
There are no hands raised.
Okay. Suzanne, I see you just joined. Thank you, Suzanne.
Enough prompting. So I am an alternate on the board, but I'm
this is the first time I've visited one of the subcommittees, I have to confess. So my question is I appreciated the comments about combining different approaches to try to get some benefit of collective problems that are in common and solving them collectively. And so to that point, I'm wondering what kind of pressure can be brought to bear on the new CGMP facilities, and are there supplements available for them identifying problems that are in manufacturing, but it might be in common among different diseases or trials or programs that they're executing on? That was a question, by the way.
Thank you. And thanks, Suzanne, for joining. Jeff.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for the manufacturing network, but having, working in close collaboration between the Alpha clinics and the manufacturing network, my understanding is that's certainly the intent. It is to identify identify those opportunities, and then there, I think what's happened at this phase, as I understand it, is the foundation's been set for those sort of collaborative approaches. I mean, very practical things like landing on common information systems and ability to do QC across multiple sites. The very, fundamental mechanics necessary to achieve that outcome. I think then within the clinical programs, to the extent you sort of say, is there leverage? I think, again, the clinical programs are sort of to some extent the leverage or the resource that can then drive that machinery forward in the context of very specific clinical programs. So I think that's all in place. I think to what the extent I think what'll be interesting is to what extent this whole process, this framework from sort of clinical through to infrastructure, then points us to, what opportunities should we, be pursuing. But I think the foundation's set for that outcome. And I think it's certainly part of the intent. It was certainly part of the intent of the manufacturing network and our various infrastructure programs to, position us in a way where, we could take this more coordinated approach.
So pressure on that arm of the program seems to me to be more appropriate than early stage investigation. I agree with the comments about early stage investigation. Speaking as a basic scientist, I think that too much emphasis on commercial value, if you will, at early stages might actually limit the different approaches that are discovered in early stages, and thereby lead you to miss some approaches that might be more efficient in the long run. So just a comment there.
Thank you. If there are no other comments, I believe this would be the end of the meeting. Thank you all for joining this morning and for your feedback. Appreciate it so much. And Jeff and I will be reaching out to some of you to get some clarification on a few questions. And we appreciate everything. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for everything.